Hello and welcome back. Today we are looking at Pentonville Prison's most notorious inmates. As usual, we will start off with the prison history and take a look at its most recent reports and reviews, and then we will get into the inmates. Pentonville Prison is located in London, in the borough of Islington, North London. It's a Category B men's prison and it has a reputation of being one of the toughest prisons in the UK. It was opened in 1842, and when the prison opened, its design was seen as very unique, the first of its kind, and this design went on to be used across the world and especially in the UK in new built prisons. It had a central hall with 4 radiating wings, all visible to staff at the centre, and this was to keep prisoners isolated instead of one whole block together. When it was first opened, it was designed to hold up to 520 prisoners. These prisoners were kept in their cells for up to 23 hours a day if they weren't working. It was known as a very strict prison where you heard almost no noise. Inmates were not allowed to talk to each other at all, and when they were allowed out to do exercise, they were still not allowed to communicate. An official report admitted that for every 60,000 persons imprisoned in Pentonville, there were 220 cases of insanity, 210 cases of delusion, and 40 incidents where someone had taken their life. They were made to work, and it wasn't a nice easy job, but hard labour, as back then it was believed you had to pay for your crimes. The work lasted from 6 in the morning until 7 at night, and they had rations for food. Everything was kept very strict. Even in the chapel, all prisoners had to attend, but they couldn't communicate. While there in the chapel, there were also isolated seats, so you could only see in front of you and not look next to you. So this would reduce them being able to talk to each other. Prisoners called these seats coffins. Also, on this prison site of Pentonville, there was the gallows. Between 1902 and 1961, a total of 120 men were executed at Pentonville Prison. They were all placed in unmarked graves in the prison's cemetery. Obviously, there was a switch in the way we would deal with prisoners and how a prison would run. The death penalty was abolished, and there was a bigger look and focus on reform and rehabilitation, so the prison changed. But unfortunately, Pentonville Prison didn't improve its reputation. It has always been seen as a very strict and highly volatile prison. The hygiene of the prison was and still is horrendous, and overcrowding got worse and worse. In the early 2000s, a report conducted by the Chief Inspector of Prisons blamed overcrowding for poor standards at Pentonville Prison. The inspection found that basic requirements for inmates such as telephones, showers and clean clothes were not being provided enough. The report also noted a lack of access to education for inmates and inadequate specialised procedures. To counter this report, in early 2005, a £15 million new hospital wing was opened. Months later, inspectors reported that despite the new facilities, the care for prisoners such as clinical supervision of nurses and drug dispensing practices was still inadequate. A major issue in Pentonville Prison was the supply of substances and dealing within the prison, not just with prisoners but also with prison officers and other staff members. In 2007, it was reported the prison was infested with rats, still had a high inmate count but were low in staff, and they had staff that were not trained well enough. 14 prison officers at Pentonville were suspended after allegations of trafficking and inappropriate relations with inmates. It was then also found multiple inmates were transferred to Wandsworth Prison before inspections and then transferred back once they were completed to make the prison look better. In 2014 and 2015, more inspections were conducted, and despite these constant inspections, nothing improved. Chief Inspector of Prisons Nick Hardwick said there are huge challenges at Pentonville and it will not have a viable future without a major refurbishment and extra staff. Pentonville had deteriorated even further since the previous inspections. In some of these inspections, they all highlighted similar things, that inmates were left without basic provisions, including pillows and utensils. There were mounds of rubbish on floors around the prison and cockroach infestations. Because of multiple failures, the overcrowding, the low level of staff, some of these staff not being trained well enough, this also reflected in how violent Pentonville prison is. And in 2016, a prisoner, Jamal Mahmood, had his life taken while in prison by Basana Kimbembe, who was 35 years old, Robert Butler, who was 31, and Joshua Ratner, who was 27 years old. They were all found not guilty of murder or manslaughter by an Old Bailey jury. Kimbembe was found guilty of wounding another inmate, Muhammad Ali, with the intent to commit GBH. At court it was stated it was gang related and because of substances that are smuggled into the prison. Jurors were told at the trial the CCTV that might have captured the crime on the upper floor of G-Wing had been deactivated years ago. There has also been an unhealthy amount of prisoners that were able to escape Pentonville prison. In 2009, convicted arsonist Julian Chatard escaped by clinging on the underside of the prison van which had delivered him to the jail from Snaresbrook Crown Court. He returned to the prison 4 days later after giving himself up. In 2012, convicted murderer John Macy escaped from within the prison confines at Pentonville on the 27th of June and was recaptured in Kent 2 days later. In 2016, two prisoners, Matthew Baker, who's 28 years old, and James Whitlock, who was 31, escaped after they used a diamond-tipped cutting equipment to break through cell bars before they scaled the prison wall. The escape was discovered when prison staff found pillows imitating bodies in the prisoners' beds. Baker was recaptured a few days later, hiding in his sister's house, while Whitlock was found by the police 6 days after the breakout. Of course, staff were blamed, but it also shows you how bad the security was. In the case of Mahmood, who lost his life, the CCTV being deactivated, the amount of time the prisoners had to escape, even going between Pentonville prison and the courthouse, being able to get in the van and escape from prison. But today, it still remains the same. Right now there is around 1,111 inmates and there are around 470 staff members. The prison was built to hold no more than 694. The current wings in the prison are A Wing, which is Early Days Centre, J Wing, Enhanced Wing, which is drug free, C Wing, Remands and Convicted Prisoners, D Wing, Remands and Convicted, E Wing, Remands and Convicted Care and Separation Unit, F Wing, Detoxification Unit, Vulnerable Prisoners, G Wing, Remands and Convicted. G Wing has an educational department, a library and workshops. It's where prisoners go to build up their education. The prison had some refurbishments in 2019, new windows were placed and new window cages, netting was put up after another escape from G-Wing. They also had netting put up to prevent drones and parcels being received. The latest report was in 2023 and these are some of the key points. There had been 7 inmates that had taken their own lives since the last full inspection, and support for prisoners in crisis was not good enough. A high amount of prisoners said they felt unsafe and they had experienced some form of victimization from staff. The prison is severely overcrowded and it could not decently or safely care for the number of prisoners it was currently required to hold. Time out of the cell was poor for most prisoners. There was a frequent regime. Attendance and punctuality at activities were poor. Most prisoners could not visit the library and they had inadequate access to the gym. Many serious concerns remained, including some fundamental weaknesses in offender management. Safety had improved with much reduced violence, a well-run segregation unit, and better governance of force. The risk for harming yourself as an inmate was not yet good enough. The report did highlight some areas of improvement, like a listening corner that had been implemented for inmates to talk to someone, and a revamp of some areas of the prison, but the report was pretty bleak, like it has been almost since Pentonville prison opened. But now we've done the history and the reports, let's get into the most notorious inmates. And first we start with Neville Heath. Neville Heath was born on the 6th of June 1917 in Essex, and he came from a lower middle class background. Despite this, his dad enabled him to go to a grammar school in Merton Park in London, Rutledge School. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1937 but was dismissed for going absent without leave. He then started to get into crimes. He was caught obtaining credit by fraud and 6 months later was sent to a bull stall for housebreaking and forgery. At this point, to do his fraud, he was using a number of different names: Lord Dudley, Lieutenant Armstrong, and at the beginning of the Second World War, Heath joined the Royal Army Service Corps and he was posted to the Middle East. After less than a year, he was shipped home but escaped the guard during the journey and went to Johannesburg. He then joined the South African Air Force and he rose to the rank of captain. Heath then got married and had a son, but at the end of the war, his wife divorced him. He was also court-martialed for wearing medals to which he was not entitled to. Heath returned to the UK in February 1946, and a few months later he had a dinner date with South African actress Maura Lister. He also had a date with Scottish actress Molly Ware. On Sunday the 16th of June 1946, he took a room at the Pembridge Court Hotel in Notting Hill. He used his real name but added the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He was with a woman, Yvonne Simmons, who she said was his wife. They had actually only just met, but he had promised Yvonne that they would get married, so she spent the night with him and returned home the next day. Just 4 days later, on the 20th of June, he then spent the evening with Marjorie Gardner, who was 32 years old. She was an artist and a film extra. She had separated from her husband who had substance abuse issues. She had a young daughter, but she was living alone in Earl's Court. They had been dancing together at the Panama Club in Kensington. The following day, the assistant manager at the Pembridge Court Hotel entered his room after the maid had been unable to gain entry. When the staff entered the room, they found Marjorie Gardner with no clothes on, with her life taken. She also had her ankles bound. She had many injuries. The police determined that she lost her life between midnight and the early hours of the morning. They then found out that Heath and Yvonne had arrived at the hotel at around midnight and that nothing had been heard until a door slammed at 1:30 a.m. Heath had left the hotel and went to Worthing to spend time with Yvonne Simmons, who he had said he would marry. Her parents were very impressed with him, especially because he was a lieutenant colonel, but he left when his name appeared in the newspapers. He then went to Bournemouth and took a room at the Tollard Royal Hotel under the name Group Captain Rupert Brooke. He then met Doreen Margaret Marshall, who was staying at the Norfolk Hotel in Bournemouth. Doreen was born in Brentford in 1924. She had served in the Women's Royal Navy Service during the war and had been discharged on the 27th of June 1946. She had gone to Bournemouth for a holiday and met Heath on the 3rd of July. He introduced himself as Group Captain Rupert Brooke. She was very impressed with Heath's looks and manners and accepted his invitation to take afternoon tea at his hotel. They spent the afternoon together. She accepted his further invitation to dine with him that evening. After dinner, Heath took her to the hotel lounge to listen to dance music. He made constant advances to Doreen and she began to feel uncomfortable. She asked another guest to call a taxi for her, claiming she was tired. Heath cancelled the taxi and offered to walk her home. When they left the hotel, Heath told the porter that he would be half an hour. Doreen corrected him and said he would only be a quarter of an hour. This was the last time Doreen was seen alive. Doreen's disappearance reported to police by the manager of the Norfolk Hotel on the 5th of July. He also contacted the manager of the Tollard Royal, knowing that she had dined there on the night she disappeared. The manager of the hotel told Heath to contact the police in case he had any information that could help in the disappearance. He contacted Bournemouth Police and offered to help. He went to the police station and from a photograph identified Doreen as the woman he had been with, but claimed he had left her in the gardens in central Bournemouth. Later that day, Doreen's father and sister, Charles Marshall and Joan, arrived at Bournemouth Police Station and by chance met Heath. He introduced himself as Brooke, and they all joked about how similar he looked to Neville Heath, who was wanted for murder. The police officer felt sure that he was the man wanted by Scotland Yard. He asked him, "Isn't your name Heath?" This was denied. He said he wanted to return to his hotel for his coat. The police then went to get his coat for him. After finding his coat, they found a railway cloakroom ticket, which in turn led them to a suitcase containing a riding whip with a diamond pattern weave, which was the same item used to take the life of Marjorie. Under questioning, he then admitted his real name, and the next day he was transferred to London, where he was charged with the murder of Marjorie Gardner. Doreen was found on the 7th of July with her life taken. His trial began on the 24th of September 1946. He told his counsel, J.D. Caswell, to plead guilty, but when Caswell questioned this he said, "Alright, put me down as not guilty, old boy." Caswell chose not to call Heath to give evidence and relied on the defence of insanity, calling William Henry Herbert, an experienced criminal psychiatrist, to testify as an expert witness. He testified that he believed Heath knew what he was doing, but not that it was morally wrong. 2 prison doctors testified that although Heath was a psychopath, he was not insane. He was found guilty and sentenced to go to the gallows. This happened on the 16th of October 1946 at Pentonville prison. A few minutes before this, it was custom he was offered a glass of whiskey by the prison governor. Heath replied, "While you're about it, sir, you might make that a double." He wrote one last letter to his parents, which said, "My only regret at leaving the world is that I have been damned unworthy of you both." We now move on to the case of John Christie, who was born on the 8th of April 1899 in Halifax. He had 6 siblings. He had a troubled childhood and he did not get on with his father. His father displayed little emotion towards any of the children and would punish them for anything. He was also bullied by his mother and older sisters. On the 24th of March 1911, his grandfather, David Halliday, passed away at the age of 75 in the household. He later said that seeing his grandfather laid out on the table gave him a feeling of power and well-being. A man he had once feared was now dead. Christie was a very intelligent boy. At the age of 11, he won a scholarship to Halifax Secondary School. His favourite subject was mathematics and he was also very good at history. He had an IQ of 128. He was described as a flamboyant lad who kept himself to himself. His attempts at intercourse were failures and he was branded "Can't Do It, Christie." In September 1916, during the First World War, he was enlisted in the British Army. He was called up on the 12th of April 1917 to join the 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment to serve as an infantryman. In April 1918, the regiment was dispatched to France, where Christie was second to the Duke of Wellington's regiment as a signalman. During the following June, Christie was injured in a mustard attack and spent a month in a military hospital. He was demobilised from the army on the 22nd of October 1919 and he joined the Air Force on the 13th of December 1923 but was discharged on the 15th of August 1924. During this time, on the 10th of May 1920, he married Ethel Simpson, and although being married, he still used ladies of the night. Early in their marriage, Ethel suffered a miscarriage, and after 4 years the couple separated. Ethel moved to Bradford to be with her family, and he moved to London. He was in and out of prison during the early years of their marriage and for the next 10 years. He got a job as a postman on the 10th of January 1921. His first conviction was for stealing postal orders. He received 3 months imprisonment. He was also convicted on the 15th of January 1923 of obtaining money on false pretences and of violent conduct, for which he was found guilty and sentenced to probation for 12 months. He then committed 2 further crimes of larceny during the 1924 and received sentences of 3 and 6 months imprisonment. On the 13th of May 1929, Christie was working as a lorry driver and was convicted of assaulting Maud Cole. He was sentenced to 6 months hard labour. In 1934, after he was released from prison, Ethel and Christie decided to try and make it work again, but he continued to visit ladies of the night. They moved into a top floor flat in Notting Hill, London, and they later moved into a ground floor flat in December 1938. At the beginning of the Second World War, he applied to join the War Reserve Police and was accepted, as they failed to check for any existing criminal record. He was assigned to Harrow Road Police Station, where he met a woman called Gladys Jones. They began an affair. This lasted until mid-1943, when the woman's husband returned from the war. Ruth Furious was a 21-year-old Austrian who would act as a lady of the night to supplement her income. Christie met her while she was soliciting clients in a snack bar in Ladbroke Grove. On the 24th of August 1943, he invited her to his home to engage in activity. His wife Ethel was visiting family. Afterwards, he took her life. He burned all evidence in his garden. At the end of 1943, he resigned as a police officer. He then found work as a clerk at Acton Radio Factory, and he met Muriel Amelia Eady. On the 7th of October 1944, Christie invited her back to his flat with the promise that he had a special mixture that could cure her bronchitis. She was breathing the mixture in from a tube with her back turned. Christie inserted a second tube into the jar connected to a gas tap. As she continued breathing, she inhaled the gas, which then made her unconscious. He then awed her and took her life, before placing her in the garden next to Ruth. In 1948, the Christies had new neighbours. Timothy Evans and his wife Beryl moved into the top floor flat at 10 Rillington Place. Beryl gave birth that October to their daughter. In late 1949, Timothy rang police to say his wife was dead. A police search of the building failed to find her, but a later search revealed that she was in the outdoor wash house with her life taken. But it wasn't just Beryl they found. Their daughter, Geraldine, also had her life taken. Timothy Evans told police that Christie had taken the life of his wife and daughter, but police questioning eventually produced a confession. The alleged confession may have been fabricated by police, as the statement appears artificial. After being charged, Evans withdrew his confession and once again accused Christie. On the 11th of January 1950, Evans was put on trial for the murder of his daughter. The prosecution decided not to pursue a second charge of murdering his wife. Christie was a witness for the Crown. He denied Evans' accusations and gave detailed evidence about the quarrels between him and his wife. The jury found Evans guilty despite the revelation of Christie's criminal record of theft and violence. Evans was originally due to be hanged on the 31st of January, but it was appealed. After his appeal on the 20th of February had failed, Evans got sent to the gallows at Pentonville prison on the 9th of March 1950. On the 14th of December 1952, Christie took the life of his wife Ethel. She had last been seen in public 2 days earlier, and to prevent any further inquiries, Christie wrote to her relatives. He told her family that Ethel had rheumatism and couldn't write herself. He told neighbours that she was visiting relatives in Sheffield, and told another that she had gone to Birmingham. On the 26th of January 1953, he forged Ethel's signature and emptied her bank account, and on the 27th of February, he sold some of his wife's clothing and her wedding ring. Between the 19th of January and the 6th of March 1953, he took the lives of 3 more women, who he invited back to 10 Rillington Place: Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina McLennan. All 3 were ladies of the night, and once they went back to his flat, he released gas into the kitchen, which made his victims drowsy. He then armed them and took their lives. He moved out of 10 Rillington Place on the 20th of March 1953, after he was caught subletting his flat to a couple. The landlord visited that same evening and told him that he would have to leave first thing in the morning. The landlord allowed the tenant above to use the kitchen. When this tenant needed to put brackets in the wall, he pulled back the wallpaper. This is where Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina McLennan were found. He was arrested on the 31st of March near Putney Bridge. The police officer searched Christie, and they discovered an old newspaper clipping about Timothy Evans. He only admitted to taking the lives of 3 women and his wife during police questioning, but when he was informed that others were found in the back garden, he admitted responsibility for all. On the 27th of April 1953, he confessed to the murder of Beryl Evans, which Timothy Evans had originally been charged with. His trial began on the 22nd of June 1953. He pleaded insanity, with his defence describing him as mad as a March hare, and claimed to have a poor memory of the events. A doctor from Brixton Prison who evaluated Christie was called as a witness by the prosecution. He testified that Christie had a hysterical personality but was not insane. The jury rejected Christie's plea, and after deliberating for 85 minutes found him guilty, and he was sentenced to the gallows. This happened at 9 a.m. on the 15th of July 1953 at Pentonville Prison. His executioner was the same one Timothy Evans had. Next is Hawley Harvey Crippen. He was born in Coldwater, Michigan, America, and had 1 son. He attended university and then medical college. His first wife, Charlotte Jane Bell, passed away of a stroke in 1892, and Crippen gave his son to his parents to look after in California. He started work in New York City as a doctor and married his second wife, Corinne Turner. By 1987, Crippen and his wife worked for James N. Munyon, who was a prominent homeopath, and they moved to London to work at the branch there. When arriving in the UK, he found that his medical qualifications that he attained from the United States were not sufficient to allow him to practice as a doctor, so he worked by distributing medicines, while his wife tried to have a stage career, which ultimately failed. He was sacked in 1899, and he worked for another patient medicine company. He was hired as the manager. He then hired Ethel Leneve, a young typist, in 1900. By 1905, they had an affair. Crippen lived with his wife in number 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Holloway. They took in lodgers so they could have more income, and his wife, Corinne Turner, Her stage name, known as Belle Amour, started to have an affair with one of the lodgers. The marriage had completely broken down. Obviously, he himself already had a mistress, being Ethel, the young typist that worked alongside him. On the 31st of January 1910, Corinne Cora disappeared following a party at their home. Crippen claimed that she had returned to the US and later added that she had passed away and had been cremated in California. While this was happening, his mistress, Ethel, moved into their home and began wearing Cora's clothes and jewellery. Cora's friend, Kate Williams, told the police that she had been missing. Other friends, including the actress Lil Hawthorne and her husband John Nash, also told the Scotland Yard. The house was searched, but nothing was found. Crippen, when questioned, admitted that he had fabricated the story about his wife having passed away, claiming that he did so to avoid personal embarrassment because she had in fact left him and fled to the US with one of her lovers, a musical actor named Bruce Miller. Crippen and Ethel began to panic, and they went to Brussels that day. They spent one night at a hotel there and then boarded the Canadian Pacific liner to head to Canada. The police actually believed Crippen's story, but because the couple disappeared, this led the police to perform further searches at the house. During the fourth search, they found that she was buried under the brick floor of the basement. By this point, Crippen and Ethel were crossing the Atlantic aboard the Montrose. Ethel was disguised as a boy. Captain Henry George Kendall recognised the fugitives, and just before steaming beyond the range of his shipboard transmitter, he had telegraphed Lawrence Ernest Hughes and sent a wireless telegram to the British authorities. This read, "Have strong suspicions that Crippen, London cellar murderer and accomplice, are among salon passengers. Moustache taken off, growing beard. Accomplice dressed as a boy, manner and build undoubtedly a girl." As the ship entered the St. Lawrence River, Officer G from the Scotland Yard came aboard disguised as a pilot. If Crippen and Ethel got to America as an American citizen, he couldn't have been arrested. Instead, there would have had to been extradition proceedings to bring him back to the UK to go on trial. Kendall, the captain, invited Crippen to meet the pilots as they came aboard. Dee removed his pilot's cap and said, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me? I'm Chief Inspector Dee from Scotland Yard." After a pause, Crippen replied, "Thank God it's over. The suspense has been too great. I couldn't stand it any longer." He then held out his wrists for the handcuffs. They were both returned to the UK. Crippen was tried at the Old Bailey on the 18th of October 1910, and his trial lasted for 4 days. Crippen's defence maintained that Cora, his wife, had fled to the US with Bruce Miller, and that Cora and Hawley had been living at the house only since 1905, suggested a previous owner of the house was responsible for the replacement of what was found in the cellar. At his trial, he showed no remorse for his wife. His only concern was that Ethel's reputation was protected. The jury found Crippen guilty of murder after just 27 minutes. Ethel was charged with being an accessory after the fact and acquitted. He was handed the death penalty, and this happened at Pentonville Prison at 9 a.m. on Wednesday the 23rd of November 1910. He always said he was innocent. Ethel left and went to the USA and then went to Canada, finding work as a typist. She returned to Britain in 1915 and passed away in 1967. Crippen was buried with a photograph of Ethel. Before he went to the gallows, he wrote a letter to Ethel, and it read, "Face to face with God, I believe that facts will be forthcoming to prove my innocence." There has been lots of research into this case, and in October 2007, Michigan State University forensic scientist David Ferran claimed that DNA evidence showed that the remains found in Crippen's cellar were not those of his wife. researchers used genealogy to identify 3 living relatives of Cora Crippen. Researchers were able to compare their DNA with that extracted from a microscope slide containing a sample from the person in Crippen's cellar. All the research that has been done also has been disputed, with the methods these forensic teams are using not being 100% in the eyes of other people. In December 2009, the UK's Criminal Cases Review Commission reviewed the case and declared that the Court of Appeal will not hear the case to pardon Crippen. Now I'm going to go through some of the actors, politicians, sportsmen, sort of celebrities and politicians that have gone through Pentonville prison. Not on huge sentences, maybe a week, maybe a couple of months, and they're definitely not the most notorious, but I think it's interesting to know some of the people that have spent time at Pentonville prison. And we start off with, in 2010, George Michael, and that was for driving offences. In 2017, Noel Ranger, who was an English footballer, and he was put in there for money laundering and fraud. Fenner Brockway was a British peace campaigner, and he later turned and became a politician. He was imprisoned in Pentonville after refusing to pay a fine imposed for publishing seditious material. You have Arthur Costell, who was detained for 6 weeks after arriving in England without papers. His novel, Darkness of the Noon, was actually published in England while he was still serving his sentence in Pentonville prison. Pete Doherty, who is the frontman of the Libertines and Baby Shambles, spent 4 nights in Pentonville in February 2005 while unable to make bail on charges that were actually dropped, and he wrote a song about the prison named Pentonville, which is on the Baby Shambles album Down in the Albion. He spent 6 weeks in Pentonville in 2011 for substance possession. Boy George spent time in Pentonville prison in 2009 for the assault and false imprisonment of a male escort, and in 1984 the football player George Best spent 7 days imprisoned in Pentonville for driving under the influence as well as assault. Now we move on to Frederick Seddon, who was born on the 21st of January 1872 in Liverpool. He married Margaret Ann on the 31st of December 1893, and the couple had 5 children. In 1909, Seddon bought a 14-room house at 63 Tollington Park near London Finsbury Park area and worked as a superintendent of collectors for a national insurance company. He was absolutely obsessed with making money. He ran a second-hand clothes business in his wife's name and also sort of dabbled in real estate. At some stage, he wanted to swindle somebody. He wanted to make as much money as he could, and he was ruthless. He and his wife advertised to let out the second floor of their London home. A neighbour, Eliza Mary Barrow, who was 47 years old and was also a spinster, responded to the advert and moved in on the 26th of July 1910 with her ward, Ernest George Grant. He was an 8-year-old orphan whose parents had been friends with Barrow. She had previously lived with her cousin Frank, but she had hoped that moving in with him and that family would be a lot cheaper for her and Ernest. She was easily led and was also keen on making money. Barrow was quickly persuaded by him to sign over her controlling interest in all her savings, including 1,500 of India stock, in return for which he would take care of her for the rest of her life, giving her a small amount of money and allowing her to live in his home rent-free. In August 1911, the Seddons, Barrow and a young ward went on holiday together to Southend. On their return, Seddon's daughter, Maggie, was sent to buy a packet of flypaper from a local chemist. Shortly after, Barrow began to suffer from agonising stomach pains. The local doctor was called and she was prescribed with morphine. On the 9th of September, he visited her again, but by the following Monday, her condition had deteriorated, but she refused to go to hospital. She improved slightly for a few days, but was confined to her bed, and on the 13th of September, she made a will, dictated to and executed by Seddon. On the morning of the 14th of September, while being looked after by his wife, Barrow passed away. Seddon then went to the doctor, who issued a death certificate without seeing her, claiming that he was unable to attend due to too much work. On the 15th of September, he went to the undertaker and arranged a cheap funeral, keeping the small commission for himself. Barrow's burial took place in a common burial plot, although her family had a vault in Highgate Cemetery, West. He later explained that this was because Barrow's family had snubbed his family during an earlier visit, and he was not prepared to allow his family to be treated in the same way again. Barrow's family missing the funeral may teach them better manners for the future. Immediately after the funeral, the family left for Southend for a 2-week holiday. Barrow's cousin, which I mentioned previously, Frank, who she had lived with, was suspicious over the suddenness of her death. He arrived to take over possession of her estate. However, he was informed that nothing was left, as he had paid the funeral expenses and the cost of Ernest Grant's upkeep himself. The family then went to the police and voiced their suspicions. She was exhumed on the 15th of November 1911. The examination was taken up by Sir William Wilcox, who was the same pathologist who helped in the Crippen trial we just previously covered. He found that there was about 2 grains of arsenic in her, and she was poisoned. Seddon and his wife became the main suspects, and it was now a murder inquiry. They had their trial at the Old Bailey. At the trial, it was shown that Margaret Seddon had previously bought a large amount of flypaper which contained arsenic. The prosecution suggested that the poison used to kill her had been obtained by soaking the flypaper in water. The defence was that she hadn't even been poisoned, and Seddon insisted on giving evidence in his own defence. It's reported that he turned the jury against himself through his arrogant and condescending attitude. His case was not helped by him representing himself. Margaret, his wife, was acquitted of having anything to do with the murder. Seddon was sentenced to death. This happened at Pentonville prison on the 18th of April 1912. After this, his widow Margaret returned to Liverpool, where she married James Donald Cameron on the 4th of November 1912, less than 7 months after his execution. She then moved to Cameron to the United States and took her 5 children with her. Now is the case of Charles Peace. Charles Peace was born on the 14th of May 1832 in Sheffield. He was the youngest son of a shoemaker, and his mum was called Jane, who was a naval surgeon's daughter. He attended school and then went on to do an apprenticeship at Mill Sands in Sheffield. At age 14, he was permanently crippled in an accident at a steel rolling mill. In 1854, he was found guilty of multiple robberies and sentenced to 4 years in prison. In 1859, he married a widow named Hannah Ward. Afterwards, he committed a major robbery in Manchester, nearly taking the life of a police officer who came to arrest him. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. After he was released, he concentrated on his picture framing business. He began working at North Eastern Railway after moving back to Sheffield. He made an acquaintance of a civil engineer who was named Dyson. In Manchester, Peace was seen by 2 policemen entering the grounds of a house on the 1st of August 1876 at around midnight. One of the officers, police officer Nicholas, intercepted him as he was trying to escape. Peace took out his firearm and warned the officer to stand back. The policeman still approached him. Peace fired deliberately wide of him, but the policeman still tried to pursue him. Peace then fired his firearm at him. The officer Nicholas lost his life on the 2nd of August. In the dark, he escaped, and two brothers living nearby, John and William Harbron, were arrested and charged with taking the life of Nicholas. John Harbron was acquitted for lack of evidence, but William, his brother, was sentenced to death, but this was later commuted to be served in prison. Peace actually made a point of attending the trial to confirm that he was not a suspect before returning to Sheffield. Peace had also developed an obsession of Dyson, his friend he met on the railway line's wife. In June 1876, Dyson threw a card into the garden of Peace's house reading, "Charles Peace is requested not to interfere with my family." On the 1st of July, Peace approached Mrs. Dyson and threatened to take her life and her husband's. So the Dyson family took out a summons against him and moved to a different area. On their first day in their new house on the 29th of November, Mrs. Dyson was accosted by Peace, who said, "You see, I am here to annoy you, and I'll annoy you wherever you go." On the same evening, just after 8 p.m, Peace watched Mrs. Dyson coming out from her back door and entering a nearby outhouse. When she emerged, he confronted her with a firearm, shouting, "Speak or I'll fire." In terror, she retreated to the outhouse and her husband came out to investigate. Peace then fled down the passage, where Dyson followed him. Peace fired at Dyson and he passed away. Mrs. Dyson cried "Murder," and Peace escaped and made his way by train to Hull. He returned to his wife who lived there, but then left again. The police put £100 on his head. The police had actually issued inaccurate descriptions of him that had to be altered, and he was changing his appearance. He was concealing his missing finger with a prosthetic arm and moving around the country to try and avoid detection. He met Mrs. Sue Thompson when he arrived in Nottingham. She became his mistress and actually betrayed him and told the police of his whereabouts. They denied her the £100 reward on the grounds that her evidence did not lead directly to his conviction. In 1877 he moved to London, and he sent for his wife and his son Willie to join him in Peckham. He loved living in London because there was an affluent suburb of Blackheath where he would rob. On the 10th of October 1878 at around 2 a.m, a Constable Robinson saw a light appear suddenly in a window at the back of a house in St John's Park. With two colleagues he approached the house and they rang a bell. Peace tried to escape through the garden and fired at Robinson, but he still closed in on him and managed to hold him down even though he had damage to his arm. Peace was remanded for a week in which he refused to give his name, but he wrote a letter to a business colleague who decided to cooperate with police. He was tried at the Old Bailey for robbery and the attempted murder of P.C. Robinson. He was found guilty and was sent to Pentonville prison. He was then taken to Sheffield, where he appeared before the courts and was charged with the murder of Dyson. This happened on the 25th of February 1879 at Leeds prison. On the morning he ate eggs and salty bacon and calmly awaited the coming of the public executioner. Whilst being walked to the gallows, the prison chaplain was reading aloud from the Consolations of Religion about the fires of hell, and Peace's last words were, "Sir, if I believed what you and the Church of God say that you believe, even if England were covered with broken glass from coast to coast, I would walk over it, if need be, on hands and knees, and think it's worthwhile living just to save one soul from an eternal hell like that." And that concludes our video today. As always, thanks so much for watching, and until next time.